ma'am," the man said, rain pouring off the brim of his helmet, his voice steady but low. "We just need somewhere dry until the road opens back up. We'll pay for everything, every single plate." Grace Bennett stood at the glass door of the Golden Lantern Diner, 63 years old, 5'4", and staring at 39 Hells Angels bikers soaking in her parking lot. Behind her, Maya had already locked the deadbolt. Frank had already gone pale. Grace reached for the lock anyway. And that one decision changed everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this little diner's story. The rain had been coming down since 3 in the afternoon. And by 7, it had stopped being rain and started being something else entirely. Something with a voice. The kind of storm that made the Blue Ridge Mountains feel like they were closing in from every direction. Like the ridgelines were pulling tighter around the valley, the way a fist closes around something it doesn't intend to let go. Grace Bennett had been watching it through the front windows for the better part of 2 hours. She had learned to read weather the way her late husband, Walter, used to read people carefully, without rushing, paying attention to the small details that most folks brushed past. And everything about this particular November storm told her the same thing. It wasn't going anywhere soon. The Golden Lantern Diner sat at the base of a long curve on Route 221, which wound up through the mountains and connected 3 counties that had very little else connecting them. It wasn't a destination so much as a waypoint. People stopped because they were tired, because they were hungry, because the road kept going and their bodies temporarily refused. Walter had understood that when he opened the place 41 years ago. He'd built the wooden booths himself, cut and sanded and stained each one over the course of a summer, talking the entire time about what a diner was supposed to be. Not a restaurant, not a business, a place where the road paused and people remembered they were human. Grace could still hear him saying it. She could still hear him saying a lot of things. The amber lamp above the entrance had been his idea too. He'd installed it the week before they opened, climbed up on a ladder in the October cold while Grace handed him tools from below, and when he finally got it working, he'd stood back and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he'd said, "As long as someone is still on the road, we leave them one light." He'd been dead 9 years. The lamp was still burning. The problem, one of several problems, if Grace was being honest with herself, was that the building around that lamp was in serious trouble. The roof had developed a leak over the back booth 2 winters ago, a slow drip that showed up every time the rain came heavy, and the pan she set beneath it was filling faster tonight than she'd ever seen it fill. The furnace had been unreliable since March. 3 of the overhead lights in the dining room flickered whenever the wind hit a certain pitch, which meant they'd been flickering almost constantly for the past hour. And the circuit panel in the back hallway made a low humming sound that the electrician she'd called in September had described in exactly these words as not great. Calvin Rourke had offered to buy the property in April. He'd come in on a Tuesday morning, sat in the booth nearest the window, ordered a cup of coffee he barely touched, and slid a folded piece of paper across the table like he was doing her a favor. The number on it was low enough that Grace hadn't even picked it up. She'd simply looked at him and said, "That's not something I'm interested in." He'd smiled, the way men smile when they've decided to be patient, because they think patience is the same as winning. "You might feel differently," he said, "when the repairs start piling up." She'd taken his coffee cup away before he'd finished it. Councilman Douglas Crane had been less subtle. He'd stopped by twice in the past month, each time with a clipboard and a different concern. The first visit, it was the porch railing. The second, it was the electrical situation. He'd walked through the dining room slowly, making notes, pausing at the back booth to study the water stain on the ceiling tile above it, and he'd said nothing specific either time. Just a lot of careful observation and pointed silence. The kind of silence that was meant to be heard. Grace's daughter Laura had called from Nashville 2 weeks ago and made the case again, calmly and thoroughly, the way she made every case, because Laura had gotten her father's patience and her mother's stubbornness, and the combination made her formidable. Mama, she'd said, you could take that money and be comfortable for the rest of your life. You've done enough. You've more than done enough. Grace had listened to the whole thing before saying, what I haven't done is give up on something that still matters. There had been a long pause on Laura's end. Then, I just don't want to watch you lose it anyway. Grace had thought about that conversation a lot since. She thought about it now, standing at the window with the storm pressing its face against the glass. Behind her, Maya Okonkwo was wiping down the counter for the third time in 20 minutes, her nervous habit, the one she defaulted to when she didn't know what to do with her hands. Maya had been working at the Golden Lantern for 2 years, 26 years old, smart and capable, and genuinely good with the customers. But she startled easily, and she carried her anxiety in her shoulders, and tonight both shoulders were somewhere near her ears. Frank DeLuca was in the kitchen, doing what he always did when things felt uncertain, cooking. There wasn't much left to cook with. At this hour, they'd been 40 minutes from closing when the storm went from bad to serious, but Grace could hear him moving around back there, and the sound of it was steadying. She was thinking about telling them both to go ahead and head home, that she'd lock up herself when the floor began to vibrate. It was a low-frequency thing at first, more felt than heard. Grace put her hand flat on the counter and felt it humming up through her palm, through the wood, through everything. Maya stopped wiping. Frank went quiet in the kitchen. The three of them stood completely still in the amber-lit diner and listened to something approaching from the direction of the highway. Then the headlights came. Not 1-5, not 10. A long river of white light pouring around the curve on Route 221, accompanied by an engine sound that was less like individual machines and more like weather itself, a low, rolling, organized thunder that grew steadily louder and showed no sign of stopping. Grace counted the bikes as they pulled into the parking lot, and she stopped counting at 20 because she understood that counting wasn't the point. They came in a rough formation, moving slowly, the lead rider guiding them in with calm hand signals, and they filled the lot completely and then some, parking in rows along the gravel edge where the lot met the shoulder of the road. Their headlights pointed in different directions, crisscrossing the rain, and in the combined light, Grace could see the leather vests, the patches, the helmets coming off one by one as the engines cut. Hell's Angels, 39 of them. Maya made a sound that wasn't quite a word and moved immediately to the door, turning the deadbolt with a sharp click that Grace felt more than heard. She had her phone out before Grace could say anything, her thumb already moving toward numbers. Maya. Grace's voice was quiet. I'm calling the sheriff, Miss Grace. Put the phone down a moment. There are 39. I can count. Sweetheart. Grace stepped to the window and looked out at the parking lot. She let her eyes move slowly across what was actually there, not what her pulse was telling her was there. She saw a man near the back of the formation holding another man upright, one arm hooked under his companion's shoulder, bearing most of his weight. She saw two more sitting on the gravel itself, their backs against their bikes, shaking in the way people shake when they've been wet and cold for too long and their bodies have stopped being polite about it. She saw helmets off and gloves off and faces turned up into the rain because they'd been riding in it for God only knew how long, and even the rain was warmer than the wind. She saw, in other words, a parking lot full of people who were exhausted and cold and stuck. The lead rider separated from the group and walked toward the diner alone. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a face that had been arranged by decades into something that was hard to read quickly, but worth reading slowly. He stopped at the door, not pounding, not trying the handle, and when Grace met his eyes through the glass, he removed his riding gloves with deliberate care, folded them, and held up one open hand. Then he knocked. 3 times. Patient. Maya, Grace said. Unlock the door. Ms. Grace, unlock it. Maya's hand hesitated on the deadbolt. Grace reached past her gently and turned it herself. She pushed the door open, and the cold and the rain and the smell of 40 miles of wet highway came in with it. And she looked at the man standing there. She would learn. His name was Raymond Dalton, that people called him Hawk, that he had been writing for 22 years and leading this particular chapter for 7. And she said, "Come in out of that." He said, "Ma'am, I appreciate it. I need to tell you there are 38 more." Grace looked past him at the parking lot. She already knew. "Then stop counting," she said, "and bring them inside." Raymond Dalton Hawk stood perfectly still for one beat. Something crossed his face that Grace couldn't name exactly, but it looked like a man recalibrating, adjusting himself to a reality he hadn't expected. Then he turned back to the parking lot and made a gesture, and 38 people began moving toward the door. Maya pressed herself back against the counter. Frank had appeared at the kitchen pass-through, and his expression went through approximately 4 different things in 4 seconds before landing on something close to resigned determination. Grace went behind the counter and started pulling mugs because whatever else was true, these were people who had been out in serious weather for a long time, and the first thing people needed after serious weather was something hot. They came in quietly. That was the first thing that surprised her. She'd been braced, she realized, for noise, for the kind of loud claiming of space that she'd unconsciously associated with the image, with the patches, with the number of them. But they came through the door in single file, and they wiped their boots on the mat, even though the mat was completely inadequate to the task. And they said, "Excuse me," when they moved past each other in the narrow entry, and they waited to be told where to sit. Several of them looked at the diner, at the amber lamp and the wooden booths and the faded menu board behind the counter with something that might have been recognition, like they'd been in places like this before, like they understood what a place like this was. A woman came through near the middle of the group. She was perhaps 40, with dark red hair pulled back severely, moving with the specific efficiency of someone who was already assessing the room for what it needed rather than what she wanted from it. She went immediately to the 2 men Grace had noticed shaking in the parking lot, who were now seated in the back booth, and she put her hands on the neck of the nearest one to check his pulse, then looked up at Grace directly. "Do you have blankets anywhere? Or extra coats? These 2 are hypothermic. Not critical, but they need to warm up slow, not fast." "I've got blankets at the house," Grace said. "It's 200 yards out the side door. I can go get them," Frank said immediately. "I'll come with you," the woman said. Then to Grace, "I'm Rachel. I'm a nurse." Grace nodded. "Blankets are in the hall closet. Take everything you find." Hawk had moved to the counter and was standing at the far end, away from the pass-through, watching his people settle into the space with the focused quiet of someone who was always, in some part of his mind, still managing the situation. He looked at Grace when she came around to his side of the counter. "I want to be straight with you about a few things," he said. "We're not passing through. The road's closed about 4 miles north. There's water over it, and they're saying it won't clear until morning at the earliest. We weren't planning to stop anywhere. We were trying to get to Roanoke before this thing got worse." He paused. "We'll pay for everything. Every meal, every cup of coffee, whatever you've got. You tell me what you need, and we'll make it right." "What I need right now," Grace said, setting a mug in front of him, "is to know if anyone out there needs medical attention beyond what Rachel can handle." Something shifted in his expression. "Tommy and Dick's are the worst of it. Rachel's good. She'll handle them." He looked down at the mug. "I don't want to cause you trouble." "You're already causing me trouble," Grace said. 39 people in a diner that was about to close for the night is trouble by definition. But trouble isn't the same as a problem. She looked at him steadily. "You asked politely. You knocked. You told me the truth about how many were waiting. That's a reasonable man doing a reasonable thing in an unreasonable situation. And I know the difference." Hawk was quiet for a moment. "Then, most people see the patch, and they stop seeing anything else." "I know they do," Grace said. "That's their loss." She left him with his coffee and went to find Frank, because the issue of feeding 39 people with what she had left in the kitchen was a logistic problem that required immediate creative attention. Frank was already ahead of her. She could hear him thinking out loud from 6 feet away, inventorying what was in the walk-in. calculating portions, working backward from what was available to what was possible. "We've got the potatoes from this morning," he said, without turning around. "About 8 pounds of sausage, a flat of eggs, 3 quarts of soup, and half a pan of cornbread from lunch." He paused. "It's enough if we think of it like a big breakfast instead of individual orders." "Then that's what we do," Grace said. The kitchen started producing food with the particular focused urgency of people who have decided on a course of action and are not interested in second-guessing it. Grace worked the counter, refilling mugs, answering questions when people had them, watching the room find its shape. And the room was finding a shape she hadn't expected. A man in the fourth booth had noticed the hinge on the men's room door, which had been 3/4 broken for months and swung unpredictably. He was examining it with the patient attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. He caught Grace's eye and said, "You got a Phillips head? I can fix this in about 5 minutes." She found him a screwdriver. 7 minutes later, the door swung clean. 2 more men had discovered the buckets beneath the roof leaks on their own. She hadn't told anyone about the leaks, hadn't said a word, and one of them had gone out to his saddlebag and come back with a small tarp which he'd rigged over the worst one to slow the drip. He'd done it without asking. When Grace thanked him, he looked almost embarrassed. "It's just a tarp," he said. "My grandfather had a place like this. I know what a leak like that means." The man who introduced himself as Victor, who turned out to be a retired electrician, had stopped in the hallway near the circuit panel. He hadn't touched it. He just stood there, with his arms crossed looking at it, with an expression Grace recognized as professional diagnosis. He finally said, "Ma'am, I don't want to overstep, but that panel's humming on a frequency that means 2 or 3 breakers are running hot. Can I take a look?" Grace said yes. Victor spent 20 minutes with a flashlight she'd gotten him from the junk drawer, and when he came back he said, "I've stabilized it for tonight. It's not a permanent fix. You need a licensed electrician to do this properly, and I can give you a name, but you won't have a fire tonight." Grace stood in the middle of her diner at 9:45 on a November evening with 39 strangers eating food her cook had stretched through an act of sheer professional will, and she was aware of something shifting in the room that she couldn't have named precisely but recognized at a cellular level. The amber lamp was still burning, the coffee was still hot, and the people sitting in Walter's booths were wiping down their own tables after they ate, stacking their plates at the end, speaking in the tones of people who understood that they were guests. Maya had stopped hovering near the phone. Grace noticed that first. Then she noticed Maya refilling coffee at table 3 and actually answering a question. Someone had asked her something about the road conditions south of the mountain and not flinching while she did it. Small things. The kind of small things that added up. It was past 10 when Hawk sat down across from her in the booth nearest the door. He'd been moving through the room all evening, checking on his people, making sure no one was giving Grace or her staff anything other than courtesy. Now he sat, and he had the look of a man who was allowing himself to be still for the first time in hours. "Tell me about this place," he said. Grace looked at him. Not the patch, not the history she'd already attached to him in the parking lot. Just the face. A man in his early 50s with tired eyes and careful hands, and something underneath the surface that had the quality of long-carried weight. "My husband built it," she said. 41 years ago. Built those booths himself. "You still run it alone?" "With Frank and Maya. My daughter wants me to sell." "What do you want?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "I want to do what Walter would have done, which is keep the light on." Hawk nodded slowly. He looked around the room at his people in the booths, at Frank moving behind the counter, at the amber lamp casting its particular warmth over all of it. Then he said very quietly, "A man named Calvin Rourke came to your place this year and offered to buy it." Grace went still. "How do you know that?" "Because Calvin Rourke did the same thing to a veteran-owned auto shop in Kingsport 2 years ago. Except there, he had help. A city councilman who started showing up with inspection forms about 2 months before Calvin's offer arrived. The air in the diner didn't change. The lamp still burned. The coffee still percolated. Frank's pans still moved in the kitchen. But Grace felt something cold settle in behind her sternum that had nothing to do with the November night. "Councilman Crane," she said. It wasn't a question. Hawk held her gaze steadily. "I don't know anything official," he said. "I just know patterns." He paused. "And I know what it looks like when someone's been set up to lose something that matters." Grace opened her mouth to respond, and the front door opened. Douglas Crane came in, out of the rain, wearing his good coat and an expression that he probably thought looked authoritative, but landed somewhere closer to agitated. He stopped inside the door and took in the room. The 39 bikers, the full booths, the organized chaos of a diner repurposed into an emergency shelter, and his jaw tightened in a way that Grace recognized. This was not concern, this was calculation. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying through the room in that practiced way of men who have spent years making sure they were heard. "I need to speak with you." Every head in the diner had turned. The room had gone quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them decides simultaneously to listen. "I'm a little busy at the moment, Douglas," Grace said. He crossed to the counter, glancing at Hawk without acknowledging him, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. "This building is not rated for this kind of occupancy. You're running an unauthorized shelter, and the individuals present represent a significant liability. These individuals," Grace said, "have been polite, helpful, and good-natured. One of them fixed my door hinge. One stabilized my electrical panel. Two of them are sitting in blankets in the back booth being treated for hypothermia by a registered nurse. So I'd be careful about the word dangerous right now." "Douglas." Crane's jaw moved. "The state of this building alone." "The state of this building," Grace said, "is my business. Unless and until you have a formal document to present me, which you don't at this moment, everything you're saying is an opinion. And I hear enough of those for free." Something moved across Crane's face. Anger, briefly, and then it went smooth and controlled and very, very deliberate. He looked around the room once more, the bikers meeting his gaze without hostility, without backing down, just looking at him, the way people look at a thing they've decided to observe, and then he looked back at Grace. "When the inspector sees this building," he said quietly enough that only she and Hawk could hear it, "you won't have a diner left to defend." Then he turned and walked back out into the rain. The room breathed again. Conversations resumed. Frank clanged a pan in the kitchen with what might have been editorial intent. Maya appeared at Grace's elbow and said, very quietly, "He dropped something." She held up a folded document, brown-edged, official-looking, its folds fresh, like it had been recently removed from an envelope. Grace took it. She opened it. She read it. Then she read it again. Hawk was watching her face. "What is it?" Grace set the paper on the counter between them. It was a preliminary demolition assessment. The property address was the Golden Lantern Diner. The client listed for the assessment was a company called Blue Ridge Development Partners, LLC. The date on the document was 3 months ago. 3 months before Crane's first visit with his clipboard. 3 months before any formal safety inspection had been requested or scheduled. "He didn't drop this by accident," Hawk said. "No," Grace said. "He didn't." She looked out the window into the rain, into the dark, where Crane's taillights had already disappeared around the mountain curve. And she thought about 41 years of early mornings and late nights, and the booth Walter had built with his own hands, and the lamp that had been burning since before her daughter was born. Then she folded the document carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and went to help Frank with the breakfast plates. Outside, the storm continued. The highway stayed closed. 39 people, who had nowhere else to be, settled into the Golden Lantern's wooden booths and let the amber light hold them against the November dark. And, in the morning, everything was going to be different. Grace didn't sleep that night. She didn't try. She sat at the counter after the last of the food was cleared, the folded demolition assessment in her apron pocket, pressing against her hip like a stone, and she watched her diner do something she hadn't seen it do in years. It breathed. 39 people, filling Walter's booths, had given the place a pulse again, conversations running low and steady across the room, the smell of coffee and warm food still hanging in the air. the occasional sound of laughter from the back corner, where four of the riders had gotten into what appeared to be a heated debate about the correct way to make biscuit gravy. Frank had weighed in from the kitchen. Nobody had agreed. The conversation had continued anyway, and it was the most alive the Golden Lantern had sounded on a Tuesday night in longer than Grace wanted to calculate. She turned the document over in her mind, the way you turn a splinter carefully, at angles, trying to understand the full shape of what was embedded there. Blue Ridge Development Partners, LLC. 3 months ago, before the first clipboard visit, before the second, before Crane had stood in her dining room and made careful, pointed notes about her porch railing. The thing about being set up, Grace was coming to understand, was that it looked a lot like bad luck from the inside. A series of unfortunate circumstances arriving in sequence, each one plausible on its own. The roof leak was real. The electrical panel was real. The furnace was genuinely unreliable. If you were the person experiencing these things without knowing what she now knew, you would simply feel like a woman whose building was falling apart at the wrong time. You would feel the walls closing in and think it was just the walls. You wouldn't think to look for the hands pushing. She heard Hawk's boots before she saw him. He had a particular way of moving deliberate without being slow, the kind of stride that came from decades of managing large groups of unpredictable people in unpredictable situations. He settled onto the stool 2 down from her and didn't say anything immediately, which she'd already learned was his habit. He thought before he spoke. It was rarer than it should have been. "You've been sitting here for an hour," he said finally. "I'm allowed." "You are." He folded his hands on the counter. "You going to tell me what's in your head or make me work for it?" Grace looked at him sideways. "What makes you think you've earned it?" "I fixed your coffee maker at 11:30, he said. "The filter basket was cracked. It was going to flood your counter by morning." Grace blinked. She hadn't known that. She looked down the counter to where the coffee maker sat, and sure enough, there was a thin bead of fresh electrical tape around the base of the basket where there hadn't been one before. She hadn't asked him to do it. He'd just done it. "All right," she said. "Here's what's in my head." She pulled the document from her apron and set it on the counter between them. "This isn't just about my diner. Whatever they're running, Crane and Rourke and whoever else has a piece of Blue Ridge Development Partners, it's bigger than one property. You told me what happened in Kingsport. That was 2 years ago. That's a pattern." Hawk nodded slowly. "A pattern needs multiple points to establish itself, which means there are other properties." She looked at him. "Which means there are other people who got Crane's clipboard visits and didn't know what they were looking at." The silence between them had weight to it. The good kind of weight, the kind that meant both people were actually thinking. "Tell me about the Kingsport shop," Grace said. Hawk was quiet for a moment, organizing what he was going to say. Veteran named Darnell Washington, 22 years Army, came home and opened an auto shop. Good reputation, steady business. Then a city councilman started showing up with concerns. Water drainage, structural questions about the bay doors, followed by an offer from a developer to buy the property at about 60 cents on the dollar. He paused. Darnell said no. 6 weeks later, he had a formal notice that the city had referred his property for a safety inspection that nobody had formally requested. The inspection found violations. The fines were significant. He sold. Grace said, "Did he fight it?" "He tried. But by the time he understood what had happened, the sale was already done and the developer had rezoned the land for mixed commercial use." Hawk's voice stayed level, but something underneath it was not level at all. Darnell lost the shop his disability checks built. His grandfather's tools were in that shop. Things you don't get back. And the councilman? Still in office. Hawk picked up his coffee cup. The developer's name on that project was Calvin Rourke. The name landed in the room like something physical. Grace felt it in her sternum. She'd known it was coming, had known since she read the document, had known at some level since the Tuesday morning Calvin Rourke had slid that folded paper across her table and smiled at her, but knowing a thing and hearing it spoken aloud were different experiences entirely. "How many?" she said. "I don't know for certain. I know Kingsport. I know of 2 others I can't fully confirm. which means there are probably more I don't know about at all. Grace folded the document again. Her hands were steady, which surprised her, because there was a great deal of heat moving through her chest right now that had nothing to do with the coffee. He picked older owners, she said. People with buildings that needed work. People who could be made to feel like the problems were their fault. Yes. People who might not know to look for the pattern. Yes. That is a very specific kind of cowardice, Grace said. Hawk looked at her with something that took her a moment to identify as respect. Yes, he said again, it is. She tucked the document back into her apron. She had a decision to make about it, who to give it to, when, in what form, and she wasn't going to make that decision at 11:40 at night on no sleep with a storm, still rattling the windows. But she knew she was going to make it. She knew she wasn't going to let it sit in her apron pocket and become a thing she was afraid of. Walter had always said that fear was not the problem. The problem was what you did with it. She stood up. There's still cornbread, she said. You want some? Hawk almost smiled. It was close enough. Yeah, he said. The night settled around them. Rachel had both hypothermic riders Tommy Chen and Dix Maravelli. She'd learned their names by now, wrapped in every blanket Grace owned. Seated near the furnace, which was behaving itself, for once, with the specific reliability of machinery that understood it was being watched. Rachel had been monitoring them for 2 hours with the calm relentlessness of someone for whom vigilance was not effort, but instinct. She'd taken their pulses 4 times. She'd made them drink warm water slowly, small sips, coaching them through it, with the patience of a person who had done this before. Grace brought her a plate without asking. Rachel looked up, and for a moment, something in her face came undone just slightly, the professional composure slipping enough to show the exhaustion underneath. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in a way that went past the plate. How are they? Grace asked. Better. They'll be fine by morning. Tommy runs cold anyway. He'll tell you differently. But he does. She glanced toward the booth, where Tommy had finally fallen asleep against Dix's shoulder. Both of them, wrapped like they'd been swaddled. He's stubborn about it. Won't wear the liner under his jacket even in October, because he says it makes him look like a tourist. She shook her head, and there was affection in it, so deep it was almost parental. Idiot. You've known them a long time. Tommy's my brother-in-law. Rachel looked at Grace directly. I know what you thought when you saw us pull in. I know what most people think. I'm not saying you're wrong for thinking it. I'm saying it's not the whole picture. I know it isn't, Grace said. I stopped thinking in whole pictures a long time ago. They take up too much room. Rachel studied her for a moment. Then she said, Hawk told us what that councilman said to you before he left. She paused. I want you to know whatever you need. Whatever we can actually do that's useful and legal and above board. You've got 39 people in this building right now who feel like they owe you something they can't pay back in one night. Grace said, You don't owe me anything. We know that, Rachel said quietly. That's exactly why we feel like we do. Grace had no response to that worth saying, so she pressed Rachel's shoulder once and went back to the counter. It was past midnight when the situation with Maya resolved itself, not dramatically, but in the incremental way that real resolutions happen quietly, in stages, without announcement. Grace had been watching it develop for the past hour. Maya had been circling the room in her waitress orbit, refilling, checking, moving, and she'd been doing it with decreasing tension in her shoulders, the way a person who has been holding their breath begins, unconsciously, to exhale. The moment it actually happened was unremarkable. A man named Jesse, a mechanic from Martinsville, she'd learn later, who had the rough hands of someone who'd been working on engines since he was 14, had asked Maya if she had any aspirin because he had a headache coming from the cold, and Maya had said yes. She kept some behind the counter, and she'd gone and gotten it and brought it back. And Jesse had said thank you, and Maya had said you're welcome, and that was the entire thing. But Grace had been watching Maya's face, and what she saw there was a person discovering that a thing she'd been afraid of was not the thing it had looked like from the other side of the glass. She went to Maya when she could do it quietly, away from the room's attention. You all right? She asked. Maya looked at her. I locked the door, she said. Earlier tonight, when they pulled in. I know, I locked it because I was scared. I know that too. Maya was quiet for a moment, working something through. They could hear the lock turn, she said. From outside. Couldn't they? Grace didn't answer that. I keep thinking about that man with his gloves off, Maya said. In the rain. With his hand up, she swallowed. He could see us through the glass. He knew I'd just locked the door. And he still just stood there, patient. He didn't pound on it or try to force it or anything. He just waited. Yes, Grace said. He did. Maya looked across the room to where Hawk was talking with two other riders near the window, his posture easy, one hand around a coffee cup. I want to say something to him, she said. I don't know what, exactly. I think I want to say something. Then say it, Grace told her. You'll find the words. It took Maya another 20 minutes to work up to it. Grace watched from the corner of her eye, not staring, giving her space. Eventually, Maya went to where Hawk was standing and said something Grace couldn't hear. Hawk listened. His face went still, and then opened in that particular way, the way a man's face opens when he's been seen accurately and isn't quite prepared for it. He said something back. Maya nodded, that was all. But when Maya came back to the counter, she was standing differently. Not taller exactly, just more settled, more present in her own skin. Grace filed it away next to the door hinge, and the circuit panel and the cornbread debate and Rachel's face when the plate arrived. Evidence of a different kind than what was in her apron pocket. The kind that didn't require a document to prove. The storm peaked somewhere around 2 in the morning, which nobody agreed on afterward because everyone had their own version of when the worst of it came. The windows flexed. The roof made a sound above the back booth that Grace did not care for, at all a deep, stressed creak that spoke to her of timbers at their limit. The bucket under the worst leak filled twice, and the man who'd rigged the tarp came and adjusted it with a flashlight, working by feel, not complaining. Victor the electrician checked the panel twice during the peak and came back both times with a thumbs up that Grace accepted with tremendous relief. Frank had been awake for 19 hours and refused to acknowledge it. He'd somehow produced a second round of food from supplies that Grace would have sworn weren't there. Biscuits from emergency dry goods she kept in the back of the pantry, a pot of beans she hadn't thought to mention, 3 pies that a regular customer had dropped off that afternoon, and that Grace had forgotten about entirely because the afternoon felt like a decade ago. He brought everything out without announcing it, just set it on the counter and said, "Eat if you're hungry," and it was gone in 20 minutes. A man named Garrett, a construction contract from Abingdon, as it turned out, who had a crew of 8 and specialized in historical building restoration, had taken a careful walk through the dining room around 1 in the morning, running his hands along the wall joints, pressing the floorboards with his heel, examining the ceiling from different angles. He did it without making it a performance. Just a man walking, looking, understanding what he was looking at. He found Grace at the counter and said, quietly so nobody else heard, "This building has good bones. The problems you've got are all addressable. None of them are structural. Whoever told you the structure was compromised was either incompetent or lying." Grace looked at him. "You're saying the diner isn't actually in danger of failing a legitimate inspection?" "I'm saying if the inspection was legitimate, you'd get a list of repairs with reasonable timelines, not a demolition assessment." He paused. "I saw what you were reading earlier. I wasn't trying to pry. I've got eyes, and I know what those forms look like. My company's dealt with 3 in the last 4 years in different counties." He stopped again, making a decision about something. All 3 had the same underlying issue. Development interest in the property that needed the owner to be willing to sell, and an owner who wasn't willing until the building started feeling like an anchor instead of an asset. Grace was very still. "How did those 3 resolve?" "2 of them sold," Garrett said. "1 of them fought." He held her gaze. "The one who fought is still standing." The room at 2:30 in the morning had the specific quality of a place where everyone has run out of pretense. When people are tired enough and warm enough and have been through enough together in a single night The particular walls that ordinarily separate strangers from one another, the careful distance. The performance of normalcy stopped being maintained, not because they've been broken down by some dramatic event, but simply because maintaining them requires energy that nobody has left. Grace learned in those hours that a man named Carlos had spent 12 years as a paramedic before an injury took him off field work, and that he now trained younger paramedics, and that the thing he'd found hardest to teach was that you could not help someone you were too afraid to touch. She learned that a woman named Bertie, full name Roberta Callahan, she informed Grace with the firm specificity of a woman who had been called Bertie, so long she'd made peace with it, had been a high school English teacher for 28 years and still carried a paperback in her inside jacket pocket because she considered a day without reading a day wasted. She learned that a quiet man named Sal in the corner booth was Hawk's oldest friend, had known him since they were both 23 and working construction in Pittsburgh, and that Sal had driven through this storm specifically because when Hawk sent a message that said he needed to find shelter, Sal had taken that to mean Hawk needed backup and had ridden 4 hours in deteriorating weather without being asked to. That's friendship, Grace said, when Sal told her. That's just Hawk, Sal said. He doesn't ask for things. So when something sounds like it might be adjacent to a request, you respond to it like a request. She understood that completely. It was nearly 3 when Hawk found the papers on the floor near the counter. Not the demolition assessment, something else. A smaller document, partially crumpled, that had apparently slid from Crane's coat pocket when he'd reached for his clipboard and hadn't noticed. Hawk picked it up, unfolded it, read it once, and then handed it to Grace without comment. It was an email chain, printed out, which told her whoever printed it was old enough to still do things that way. The exchange was between Crane's personal email address and an account Grace didn't recognize until she read down to the signature line and saw the name of the law firm. The same law firm listed in the fine print at the bottom of Calvin Rourke's offer letter. The one she hadn't thrown away because some instinct had told her to keep it. The emails discussed the Golden Lantern specifically. They discussed the inspection timeline. They discussed what Crane described as the voluntary compliance pathway, a phrase that made Grace's jaw tighten because she recognized it as the kind of bureaucratic language that meant something entirely different from what it sounded like. They discussed, in one exchange that was blunter than the others, the likelihood that the owner would reach an acceptable decision point once the financial pressure became sufficient. An acceptable decision point. That was her. That was what she was in these emails. A decision point to be reached. He dropped this intentionally, Hawk said, for the second time that night, watching her read. I'm not sure, Grace said this time. I am. He leaned forward slightly. He's rattled. Whatever he expected when he came in tonight, chaos. Probably something he could use, he didn't find it. He found 39 people behaving themselves and a woman who wasn't afraid of him. And that's not what he prepared for. Men like Crane don't drop things by accident. They drop them as warnings, as messages. He wants you to know how far this goes. Grace looked at the email chain for a long moment. Then she looked at Hawk. He made a mistake, she said. He did. He thinks showing me the size of it is going to make me feel small. Hawk said nothing. He doesn't understand yet, Grace said, what he actually showed me. She folded the email chain and put it with the demolition assessment. 2 documents now. 2 pieces of a picture she was assembling in real time, the way you assembled a picture when you were finally paying attention. She had the shape of it now. She had the scope. She had, for the first time since April when Calvin Rourke's offer landed on her table, a clear understanding of the actual problem rather than the problem that had been presented to her. The actual problem was not her roof. The actual problem was not her panel or her porch or her furnace. The actual problem was that someone had looked at her diner, at 41 years of Walter's labor and her own, at the amber lamp and the wooden booths and the community that still, however thinly, gathered around them, and seen only what they could make of it if she was no longer in it. That was the actual problem, and it had a solution. She didn't know yet exactly what the solution looked like, but she had 2 documents, a building full of witnesses, a retired contractor who understood restoration, an electrician who'd stabilized her panel, a nurse monitoring her guests, and a man across the counter from her who had spent 7 years leading 39 people through difficult terrain and still asked before he entered someone else's door. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. It was past 4 in the morning when the storm began to find its edges. You couldn't call it easing. It was still fierce, still speaking in the old language of November mountains, but there was a change in the way it pressed against the building. Less like it was trying to get inside, and more like it was simply reminding you it was there. Several riders had fallen asleep in the booths, heads resting on folded arms or jacket sleeves, breathing slow and even. Tommy and Dix had been properly warm for 2 hours. Rachel was asleep herself now, upright in the booth across from them, one hand still loosely on the table near where she'd been taking pulse checks. Frank had finally sat down. Grace had put a cup of coffee in front of him without comment, and he had accepted it without comment, and they had sat together at the counter in the particular companionable silence of people who have been through something real and don't need to discuss it to know they both survived it. Maya was still awake. Grace found her near the window at some point around 4:30, not looking out at the weather. There was nothing to see but looking at the reflection. Her own face in the glass, and behind it the room, the amber-lit diner full of sleeping strangers. "Grace," Maya said without turning around, "when you unlocked that door tonight, were you scared?" Grace considered the question. "Yes," she said. "I was, but you did it anyway." "I did." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Grace thought about Walter and the lamp and 41 years of open doors and the simple arithmetic of a man standing in the rain with his gloves off and his hand up. She thought about what it meant to be seen before being known, and what it meant to be seen as a threat before anyone had given you the chance to be anything else. "Because fear is information," she said. "It tells you to pay attention. It doesn't tell you what to decide." Maya turned away from the window then, away from her own reflection, and looked at the room with an expression Grace recognized because she'd worn it herself at various points across 63 years. It was the expression of a person in the process of updating their understanding of the world, and doing it honestly without looking away. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat. The highway was still closed. The mountain held everyone where they were. And in the Golden Lantern Diner, with its leaking roof and its humming panel now stabilized, with Walter's booths full and the amber lamp still burning, something had changed in the night's long hours that couldn't be changed back. Hawk was at the counter when the notification came through on his phone. He read it without expression, then looked up at Grace. "Roads staying closed until morning," he said. "Emergency management confirmed. Landslide about 4 miles north. Both directions blocked." He paused. "We're here until daylight at minimum." Grace nodded. She'd known. The mountain always made its own decisions. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, in the quiet of that nearly 5 in the morning diner, was what Hawk had done 2 hours earlier when she'd been in the back checking on Rachel. She didn't know about the photograph he'd taken. The amber lamp glowing through the rain, 39 bikes in the parking lot, and through the window, the warm interior of a diner that had opened its door when it didn't have to. She didn't know about the message he'd posted. Simple, direct, aimed at every regional chapter contact he had, from Virginia to Tennessee to West Virginia and beyond. She didn't know any of that yet. She would, at dawn. Grace was on her second cup of coffee when the first response came through on Hawk's phone. He was sitting 3 stools down from her, and she heard the notification a different tone than the standard chime, something more like a pulse, and she watched him pick up the phone, read the screen, and go completely still in the way that large, self-contained men go still when something has surprised them. "What?" Grace said. He didn't answer immediately. He read the screen again. Then he set the phone face down on the counter and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "I did something a few hours ago," he said, "while you were in the back checking on Rachel." Grace waited. "I took a photograph of the diner. From outside the lamp, the bikes, the window. I posted it to our regional network. I told them what happened tonight, what you did. And I told them what those documents suggest someone is planning to do to you. He looked at her steadily. I didn't ask for violence. I didn't ask for threats. I asked if anyone had skills, tools, supplies, or evidence that might be useful. I asked them to come peacefully once the roads opened. Grace was very quiet. I should have told you first, he said. Yes, Grace said. You should have. I know. She looked at the phone lying face down on the counter. How many responses? He picked it up and turned it over. The screen was lit with notifications, stacked the way messages stack when they've been coming in faster than anyone's been reading them. He scrolled without speaking for a long moment. Then he said, 47 responses in 2 hours. Grace set down her coffee cup. From where? Virginia, Tennessee, North. He kept scrolling. West Virginia, Kentucky. He stopped. Grace, these are people saying they're coming. Not asking if they should. Saying they are. The number landed differently than she'd expected. Not as comfort, not immediately first, as something closer to vertigo. The feeling of a situation expanding past the boundaries she'd set for it in her mind. She'd been managing this night in increments. 39 people. One storm, one document, one night. The idea of a second wave, a deliberate, organized second wave, arriving at dawn, rewrote the scale of everything. She took a breath. How many people are we talking about? Hawk looked at the screen again. His jaw moved slightly. If even half of these show, he said, somewhere between 300 and 400. Grace stood up from her stool. She walked to the end of the counter, turned around, and walked back. It wasn't pacing exactly. It was the physical expression of a mind working at speed. They'll use it, she said. Crane Rourke. If 400 bikers arrive at a small mountain diner at first light, they will use that image to say exactly what they've been trying to say about you and your people. Dangerous. A mob. A threat. They'll have their narrative handed to them. I know, Hawk said. That's why I was specific in what I asked for. Skills. Tools. Evidence. Peaceful presence. He set the phone down. I can't control who comes. I can tell you what I asked for and what I didn't. What exactly did you say? Word for word. He picked up the phone, found the post, and read it aloud exactly as he'd written it. It was brief. 38 words. He'd said a woman had opened her last safe door to 39 strangers on a mountain in a storm. He'd said by morning powerful men intended to close it forever. He'd said if anyone had something useful to offer, skills, documentation, hands that knew how to build rather than break, to come after the roads cleared. He'd said to come peacefully or not at all. Grace listened to every word. Then she said, that's a good message. It's an honest one. Same thing when it's done right. She picked up her own coffee, found it had gone cold, and put it down again. All right, then we work with what's coming. We can't stop it, and I won't pretend I want to. She looked at him. But if those people arrive, and this turns into something it shouldn't be, the only person who loses everything is me. You understand that? I understand it, Hawk said, which is exactly why I'm going to be on that highway at first light, telling every single rider who pulls up what the terms are before they get out of that parking lot. They looked at each other across the counter, and Grace made a decision the way she made most real decisions, not by deliberating further, but by recognizing that she'd already made it and just needed to stop pretending otherwise. Then I'll make more coffee, she said. We're going to need it. The remaining hours before dawn moved with a strange compressed quality, like time behaving differently when it knows something significant is approaching. The riders who'd been sleeping in the booths began waking in the 5 o'clock hour, gradually reaching for phones and checking the road status with the automatic hopefulness of people who've learned not to be surprised when the answer is still no. The landslide notification hadn't changed. Both directions, 4 miles north, blocked until further notice. Rachel came fully awake at 5:15, checked Tommy and Dick's with crisp professional efficiency, declared them both fine with the tone of someone who had never doubted they would be, and then asked Frank with complete directness whether there was any coffee left and how she could help. Frank handed her a cup and put her to work without ceremony, and within 10 minutes. Rachel was moving through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd cooked in tight spaces under pressure before, which, she later told Grace, she had 3 years on a wilderness medicine team where the kitchen was whatever flat surface you could find. Garrett found Grace at 5:30. He'd been awake for most of the night. She realized she'd caught glimpses of him at various points, always doing something quiet and useful, never announcing it. Now he sat across from her, in the booth, nearest the door, and put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. "I made a list," he said. "Everything I assessed last night, prioritized by urgency, with rough estimates on materials and labor." He let her pick it up. "The roof is the most pressing. That leak over the back booth has been going on long enough that the substructure underneath is compromised, not catastrophically, but it needs to be addressed before another heavy winter, or you'll have a real problem. The panel's still stabilized, but it needs a proper replacement within 6 months. The furnace just needs a cleaning and a specific part that I'd guess hasn't been serviced in 2 years." He paused. "None of this is insurmountable. None of it justifies a demolition assessment." Grace read the list. Itemized, specific, the handwriting of a man who took precision seriously. "What would this cost?" she asked. "If you're paying commercial rates, 15 to 20,000. If you have people who know what they're doing and are willing to do it at cost or donated labor, significantly less." He looked at her. "I know licensed roofers who've done work like this pro bono for community properties. I know electricians who volunteer their time. I'm not making you a promise. I'm telling you the resources exist if you're willing to let them be used. Why would they volunteer for a diner they've never heard of?" Garrett looked at her with something close to patience. "They wouldn't have," he said, "yesterday." But Hawk's message went to a network of several thousand people at 2 in the morning. By now, he checked his phone. It's been shared outside the original network. "I've got texts from people I haven't spoken to in 3 years asking if this is the diner on Route 221. He set the phone down. "You've heard of something going viral?" Grace said that she had, in the general sense. "This is what that looks like at dawn," Garrett said. "Before the news trucks arrive." News trucks. Grace hadn't thought that far. She made herself think it, now sat with it, turned it over, assessed it the way she'd assessed the storm, when it was still 2 ridgelines away. The story of 39 Hells Angels sheltering in a mountain diner during a catastrophic storm was, she understood with sudden, clear-eyed recognition, exactly the kind of story that media ran with. Add a corrupt councilman and a fraudulent demolition assessment and an approaching convoy of hundreds, and it wasn't a regional interest story anymore. She felt the weight of that shift somewhere in her spine. "If reporters come," she said slowly, "I need to be the one controlling what this story is about. Not Crane, not Rourke, not even," she paused and said it honestly, "not even the drama of all this. This needs to be about what those documents say. What they did to that veteran in Kingsport. What they've been doing to people along this highway who didn't have anyone paying attention." Garrett was nodding before she finished. "Then you need to be ready. Documents organized. Narrative clear. Someone who can speak to the legal dimensions." He paused. "Do any of your 39 guests happen to include a lawyer?" From across the room, without looking up from his phone, a man named Conrad said, 22 years. Civil and municipal. Grace looked at him. He was in his mid-60s, trim, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular stillness of a person who had spent decades being the calmest person in difficult rooms. "I heard," he said simply. "I've been awake. And yes, I've been reading those documents since Hawk photographed them at 2:30. You have enough here for a formal complaint to the State Ethics Commission and a civil action. Possibly more, depending on what the pattern looks like, across the other properties." He finally looked up. "I'll need to make some calls when the sun's up. Do you have a copier?" "I have a scanner," Maya said, from behind the counter. She'd been awake this entire time, Grace realized. Completely awake, completely present, taking in everything. "I can scan everything to a drive right now." Grace looked at the room, at Conrad with his reading glasses and his 22 years, at Garrett with his restoration list, at Rachel cleaning the kitchen alongside Frank, at Hawk on his phone, coordinating what was coming down the mountain, and she felt something she hadn't felt in this building since Walter died. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. Something with structure to it. She said, "Maya, scan everything." Dawn came the way it always comes after a bad storm, reluctantly, in stages, like it needed convincing. The rain had mostly stopped. The roads were still closed. And from both directions of Route 221, two of the riders who'd been monitoring communications had gone out on foot to the edge of the lot to watch the highway. They came back in at 6:47, and the one named Polly, who had been largely silent all night, but had replaced two loose floorboards in the hallway at some point, without being asked, came directly to Hawk and said three words. "They're coming, brother." Hawk was on his feet before the sentence was finished. Grace followed him to the door. She heard it before she saw it. A low vibration in the floor, different from last night's random thunder. This was organized, rhythmic, the kind of sound made by machines moving in deliberate formation. She put her hand on the door frame and felt it, traveling up through the building's bones. Hawk pushed the door open, and they stood in the cold November morning air together, and from the north end of the highway, the cleared section, the direction that had opened sometime in the past hour, without anyone inside being notified, headlights appeared. Not one set, not 10. A river of them, stretching back further than Grace could see in the gray early light, moving in ordered procession, taking the curve slowly and deliberately, like whoever was leading them had given specific instructions about exactly this moment. And from the south, Grace turned, disbelieving. More headlights. The same organized approach, the same deliberate pace. They were coming from both directions simultaneously. "How?" she started. "The south road must have cleared overnight," Hawk said. His voice was very quiet. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about the south road." He was looking at the procession with an expression that she understood, finally, was not the face of a man managing a situation. It was the face of a man who had also been surprised. "This is bigger than what I asked for." They kept coming. Bikes and vans and pickup trucks, with lumber stacked in beds and trailers loaded with equipment she couldn't identify in the early light. They filled the parking lot within minutes and kept filling it, spilling onto the shoulder, the engine sounds overlapping and combining into something that was less noise and more pressure, the air itself changing texture. Hawk went to the edge of the lot immediately. She watched him go, watched him position himself at the entrance, and begin talking to the lead riders as they arrived, shaking hands, speaking quickly, directing them with the authority of a man who had already decided decisively what this was going to be before it had a chance to become something else. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the responses, nods, hands raised in acknowledgement, riders passing the message back down the line, the way instructions travel through any experienced group, person to person, without drama. Rachel appeared at Grace's shoulder. "How many?" she said. "I can't count them," Grace said. "Neither can I," Rachel said. And she sounded, for the first time since they'd arrived, genuinely awed. Conrad was on his phone inside, speaking in the measured tones of a man who has placed calls that matter before and knows not to telegraph urgency with volume. Maya was at the scanner. Garrett had gone out to the truck convoy and was speaking to the lead driver of what turned out to be a roofing crew out of Roanoke's 6 men, licensed, with a full load of materials, who had driven 3 hours starting at 4 in the morning because had seen Hawk's message, and one of them had read the demolition assessment Conrad had posted in the regional thread and said out loud to the other 5, "That's fraud. That's just outright fraud. We're going." Frank had started cooking again. Grace didn't ask him when he'd restocked. She didn't want to know how many emotional miles Frank had run overnight on her behalf. It would have required sitting down to absorb. And sitting down was not currently an option. She was standing at the edge of the lot, watching the procession settle, when she heard the other car. Not a bike, a car, a county vehicle, moving too quickly for the conditions, coming from the south, and she knew before it stopped who was inside it. Douglas Crane got out of the passenger side. Calvin Rourke got out of the driver's. They both stopped dead when they saw the lot. The lot that was, by now, holding somewhere north of 400 people. Organized, quiet, working. Rourke said something to Crane that Grace couldn't hear. Crane's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, then calculation, then the particular kind of controlled anger that comes from a person realizing that the situation they've arrived to dominate has already moved past them. He straightened his coat. He walked toward Grace with the manner of a man who had decided that forward was the only direction left. "Grace," he said, "you need to disperse these people. This is an unlawful assembly, and the county has the authority." "The county does not have that authority," Conrad said. He had appeared at Grace's right side so quietly that even she startled. He had his reading glasses down on his nose now, a yellow legal pad in one hand and his phone in the other, and he looked at Crane with the pleasant expression of a man who has been waiting patiently for a door to open and is simply walking through it now that it has. "Conrad Marsh," he said, 22 years civil and municipal law. I've been reviewing the documents Mr. Crane dropped in this establishment last night, and I'd like to ask him a few questions about the relationship between Blue Ridge Development Partners, LLC, and his office's inspection scheduling process." Crane went very still. "That's a private matter. The documents aren't private," Conrad said. "They were dropped in a public-facing business and recovered by the establishment's owner. They're her property now, legally, and I've already forwarded copies to the State Ethics Commission this morning." He paused, in the way lawyers pause when they want the silence to do specific work. "A colleague of mine at the commission has confirmed receipt. They've flagged it for priority review, given the volume of documentation and the cross-referencing with a 2022 complaint from Kingsport, Tennessee." Rourke said sharply, "What Kingsport complaint?" "The one filed by Darnell Washington," Conrad said, without looking at him. "Concerning irregularities in the inspection process that preceded the forced sale of his property to your development company." He did look at Rourke then. "A complaint that was filed but not pursued at the time due to insufficient documentation. The documentation is now sufficient." The silence that followed had a quality Grace had not experienced before. It was the silence of a room, or, in this case, a parking lot that has just collectively understood that something has shifted past the point of shifting back. She could feel it in the people around her, in the way everyone had gone still and oriented, even those too far away to have heard the conversation, reading it from posture and proximity, the way humans read rooms when something important is happening. Crane looked at Grace, not at Conrad, not at the crowd, at Grace. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. His voice had lost its performed authority. What was left underneath it was something smaller and more genuine, which perversely made him seem more dangerous, because genuine things were harder to predict than performances. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Grace said. "I'm standing on my property, which you have not legally compelled me to vacate, in the company of several hundred people who are here to help me repair it, which they are licensed to do, which you have no authority to stop." She looked at him steadily. "And I am looking at you, Douglas, and I am waiting for you to one single thing this morning that is actually true." Crane opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Rourke put a hand on his arm and said something too quiet to hear, and Crane shook him off, and for a moment, the tension between the two of them was as readable as anything. Two people who had been aligned in something, and were now separately calculating what that alignment was going to cost them. It was Hawk who stepped forward, not aggressively, not even quickly. He simply moved from where he'd been standing 20 feet back and came to stand at Grace's left side. And the effect of his presence there, his size, his stillness, the particular quality of a man who has decided to be exactly where he is and is not considering alternatives, was such that both Crane and Rourke took one involuntary step back. Hawk placed his phone on the hood of the county vehicle. "Face up," a voice came from it. A woman's voice, clear and measured, with the specific diction of someone in a professional capacity who is on a recorded line and knows it. "Mr. Crane, this is Linda Ferris, Office of the State Inspector General. I've been asked to inform you that as of 6:40 this morning, a formal review of your office's inspection activities over the past 3 years has been opened. You are not required to speak with me today, but anything you say in a public setting may be included in that review. I'd encourage you to contact your attorney. Crane stared at the phone. Grace looked at Hawk. Hawk said quietly, Conrad made a call at 6. I gave him the phone number. I got the number from a writer in West Virginia who does compliance work for the state. I've been building to this for 4 hours. He paused. I told you I'd be on that highway talking to every rider before they got out of the lot. I've also been talking to Conrad. Grace said nothing for a moment. The sound of saws beginning somewhere behind the diner, the roofing crew starting their assessment, filled the space her words would have occupied. Then she said, You're a complicated man, Raymond. I've been told, he said. Crane left without speaking again. Rourke followed, and the county vehicle pulled out of the lot in the particular way of vehicles driven by people who are controlling their speed through effort, not ease. Grace watched them go. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more durable, the feeling of a thing that had been pointed in the wrong direction for a long time being slowly, forcibly corrected. The morning opened up around her. Licensed roofers were already on the building within the hour, having done a rapid assessment with Garrett and found everything consistent with his overnight evaluation. An electrician team out of Lynchburg, 3 people, fully licensed, with a county permit that Conrad had somehow arranged by 7:15 began pulling the old panel. A heating specialist from a company in Boone, who'd driven over the mountain before the South Road was officially cleared, found the furnace problem in 40 minutes flat and had already called in the specific part from a supplier in Asheville. There were people everywhere, and none of it was chaos. That was the thing Grace kept returning to. The thing she hadn't expected, even knowing it was coming, the sheer organized productivity of it. People who had arrived to do a specific thing and were doing that specific thing, and asking before they started, and reporting to whoever was coordinating each area, and staying out of the spaces where they weren't needed. The parking lot had a flow to it. The diner had a flow to it. Frank had somehow produced food to feed what felt like a small army, aided by supplies that kept arriving from the back of pickup trucks, cases of eggs, boxes of coffee, bread, produce, donated by people who'd heard where they were going and stopped to pick up something useful on the way. A woman Grace didn't know appeared at her elbow at around 8 o'clock. She was perhaps 45, with a press badge clipped to her jacket and a recorder in her hand that she held down at her side. Not up a choice Grace noticed and appreciated. Miss Bennett, she said. I'm a Del Park Blue Ridge Register. I drove up from Wytheville this morning because someone in our network flagged the story. She paused. I'm not here to make something out of nothing. I've been watching this for an hour. I've talked to 4 people who've shown me their licenses, their permits, and their copies of the documents from last night. She looked at Grace directly. I want to tell the true version. Can you talk to me? Grace looked at the reporter for a long moment. Then she looked at Conrad, who had been within earshot, and gave her a small, confirming nod. Yes, Grace said. But you're going to drink coffee while we do it, because I'm not talking to anyone this morning who doesn't have something warm in their hand. Adele Park almost smiled. That's fair. They sat in the booth nearest the door, Walter's booth, the one he'd built first and sat in most, and Grace told the true version. She was precise about what she knew and careful about what she was still confirming. And she let the documents speak where her words ran short. She talked about the night, about the knock on the glass and the open hand, about Maya locking the door and the reason she'd overridden it, about the cornbread and the blankets and Victor with his flashlight and the broken door hinge and the man who knew what a roof leak meant because his grandfather had a place like this. She talked about Darnell Washington in Kingsport and the auto shop with his grandfather's tools. She talked about the amber lamp. Adele Park wrote everything down. And when Grace finished, she sat back and looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up and said, What do you want people to take from this? Grace thought about that. She thought about Walter and 41 years and the folded documents in her apron pocket, and 400 people on a Tuesday morning choosing to be here when they didn't have to be. I want them to understand, she said, that there's a difference between trust and observation. I didn't trust 39 strangers. I observed them. I watched how they moved and what they did and what they asked for and what they didn't. And what I observed was people. She stopped for a moment. Fear is a reasonable response to the unknown, but it's not an answer. You can be afraid and still open the door. You can be careful and still be kind. Those things aren't opposites. People have been taught they're opposites, and that's the lie that makes it easy for men like Crane to do what he did. Because if everyone's afraid, nobody looks. And if nobody looks, nobody sees the pattern. Adele wrote it down. Outside, the saws were running. The generators were humming. 400 and some people were rebuilding a diner that someone had decided to take. And they were doing it with permits and licenses and receipts and the particular dignified fury of people who have chosen craft over conflict. The amber lamp was still burning. It was 8:43 in the morning, and the story of the Golden Lantern had not yet reached its highest point. Adele Park's article went live at 11:17 that morning. Grace didn't know this immediately because she was on the roof not doing the work herself, but standing at the base of the ladder talking to the lead roofer, a compact, efficient man named Dennis, who communicated in short declarative sentences and had a gift for explaining structural problems in plain language without condescension. He was telling her about the substructure situation in the back corner, confirming everything Garrett had said the night before. And Grace was listening carefully and asking precise questions because 41 years of running a building had taught her that the only thing worse than not knowing what was wrong was knowing but not understanding it well enough to ask the right follow-up. Her phone started buzzing at 11:22. 5 times in 30 seconds, which was 4 times more than her phone normally buzzed in an entire afternoon. She looked at the screen. Messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Then a call from Laura. She answered it. Mama. Laura's voice had a quality Grace hadn't heard in it since the day she'd called to say her father was gone, a kind of compressed urgency. The voice of a person holding something large, very tightly. Mama, I need you to tell me what is happening up there right now. We're repairing the roof, Grace said. I'm looking at a news article that has 463 shares in the last 20 minutes. Grace was quiet for a beat. Adele works fast. Who is Adele? Mama, there are photographs. There's one photograph of you and this man, this big man with the gray at his temples, standing in front of a county vehicle, and he's got a phone on the hood, and you look— Laura stopped. You look like you're the one in charge of everything. I'm in charge of my property, Grace said, which I've been in charge of for 41 years. That's not what I— Laura took a breath. Grace could hear her resetting, the way Laura always reset one deliberate breath, like turning a valve. I'm coming up. I'm already packed. I'll be there by 3. Laura, you don't need to— Mama, her voice broke, just slightly, and then it held. Please let me come. Grace looked at the building around her. The roofers above. The sound of the new panel being tested in the back hallway. The smell of Frank's cooking, reaching her even out here, which was either evidence of good ventilation or Frank cooking at a volume the laws of physics should have prevented. Come, she said. We'll feed you when you get here. She hung up and went inside. Conrad had set up a temporary workspace at the foretop in the back corner, the table now covered in organized stacks of documents and 3 yellow legal pads in different stages of notation. He had his phone pressed to one ear and his pen moving across the top pad simultaneously. And he held up one finger at Grace without looking at her, which she interpreted correctly as I need 90 more seconds, not I'm dismissing you. She waited. He finished the call, set the phone down, capped his pen, and looked at her. State Ethics Commission has officially opened a formal investigation, he said. Not preliminary review, formal investigation. That's a significant step, and it happened faster than I expected, which tells me they already had something on Crane before our documents arrived, and were waiting for additional material. Grace sat down across from him. They had a file, They had a file. Conrad's expression did something complicated, which means this has been building longer than the Kingsport complaint. There may be a third property, potentially in Carroll County, a family-owned hardware store that closed 18 months ago under circumstances that looked like financial failure but are now being re-examined. He paused. The owner's name is Margaret Sorensen, 71 years old. She's been telling her daughter for a year and a half that something about the inspection process felt wrong, but she didn't have anything concrete to point at. He looked at Grace. Now she does. Grace absorbed this. Margaret Sorensen, 71, a hardware store in Carroll County. A daughter who'd probably made practical, loving arguments about selling and moving on and letting it go. We need to call her, Grace said. Already have a number, Conrad said. I was going to suggest you make that call rather than me. She doesn't know me. She knows what's happened here because it's been circulating since Adele's piece dropped. She might talk to you. He slid a piece of paper across the table. When you're ready. Grace picked it up and held it. Not yet. She needed to think about what to say to a woman who'd already lost the thing Grace was fighting to keep. And she needed to say it right. She was still holding it when the sheriff's department arrived. Not Crane's county vehicle this time. The county sheriff himself, a large, unhurried man named Roy Blankenship, who had been in office for 11 years and had the particular quality of a person who had stopped being impressed by drama sometime around his 4th year on the job. He came through the door, looked around the diner with the comprehensive attention of a man who assessed rooms professionally, saw Grace, and walked directly to her. Miss Bennett, he said, I need to talk to you about this morning. Grace stood. Then talk. Not you specifically. To you about other people. He glanced at Conrad, taking in the legal pads and the organized documents with one sweep, then looked back at Grace. I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing materials that were forwarded to my office this morning by the state. I've also been contacted by the Ethics Commission, the Inspector General's office, and he paused. As though this particular addition still surprised him, a compliance specialist with the state attorney general, who was apparently on a phone that was placed on the hood of my colleague Douglas Crane's vehicle about 2 hours ago. Conrad said, mildly, Linda Ferris. We went to law school together. The sheriff looked at Conrad for a long moment. All right, he said. Then to Grace, what I'm here to tell you is that as of approximately 10 this morning, Douglas Crane has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He is not acting in any official capacity. Any authority he attempted to exercise over this property earlier today was not backed by this office. He paused. I want to be clear about that. Whatever he said to you, whatever he threatened, that's on him. Not on the county, Grace said. And Calvin Rourke? Mr. Rourke's development company is being looked at for the Kingsport matter specifically. The civil side. That's above my pay grade, but I've been asked to preserve any documentary evidence relevant to his activities in this county. He looked at the table behind Grace without making a move toward it. I understand you have some. Conrad, Grace said. Already copied, Conrad said. He produced a sealed manila envelope from the stack and held it out to the sheriff. Chain of custody documentation is inside. Originals are secured separately. The sheriff took the envelope. He held it for a moment, and something in his face shifted the practiced neutrality, giving way, briefly, to something more personal. He looked at Grace. My grandmother ran a lunch counter in Galax for 30 years, he said. Somebody tried to buy her out in 1987. She told them no. He stopped. I'm glad she did. He nodded once, put the envelope under his arm, and left. The room exhaled, multiple people at once, without coordinating it, which meant the room had been holding its breath and hadn't known it. Frank said, from the kitchen pass-through, does this mean I can stop worrying about the police? You can stop worrying about Crane's people, Grace said. As for the rest, that depends on your general relationship with law enforcement. Frank, historically complex, Frank said and went back to his cooking. The laughter in the room was genuine and sudden, and it loosened something that had been wound tight since at least 2 in the morning. Grace felt it physically, a kind of release in her shoulders. She hadn't noticed she was bracing. It lasted about 4 minutes. Then Maya appeared from the back hallway with her phone held out and an expression Grace hadn't seen on her before, something between disbelief and a very specific kind of alarm. "Miss Grace," Maya said. "The article. It's not just regional anymore." She handed Grace the phone. The article was open on the screen, and below it, the share count that had been 463 when Laura called. It was now 11,240. And climbing in real time, the number ticking upward every few seconds like a meter running. Grace stared at it. "There's a news van," Maya said, "coming up the highway from the south. I can see it from the back window. And I think there might be another one behind it." Grace handed the phone back. She straightened. She thought about what she'd told Adele, about fear and observation and opening the door. She thought about the difference between a story that was yours and a story that belonged to everyone who was watching it. "All right," she said. "Then we give them something worth filming." She went outside. The activity in the lot was exactly what it had been all morning: organized, purposeful, visible in the best possible way. Licensed contractors doing documented work. People serving food without being asked to. A group of 6 veterans who'd arrived together in a truck from Christiansburg, setting up a portable canopy over the serving area because someone had noticed the sky changing and didn't want the food to get wet if the weather shifted again. All of it organic, all of it real, all of it happening because people had decided on their own that this was a thing worth doing. Kobe. Hawk was at the edge of the lot talking to the arriving news crew before their van had fully stopped. Grace watched him from across the lot, watched him shake the reporter's hand, say something that made the reporter nod seriously and take out a notebook, point toward the work happening on the building. She couldn't hear him. She didn't need to. She knew what he was doing. He was framing it before anyone else could. When she reached them, the reporter, a young man from a Roanoke station, whose name she immediately forgot and had to relearn twice, was already writing. He looked up at Grace with the particular alertness of a journalist who has arrived at a story bigger than the one he was dispatched for. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "can you tell me what you want people to understand about what's happening here today?" Grace had been asked this twice now, by Adele and now by him. She suspected she was going to be asked it many more times before the day was finished, and she was going to need an answer that was both true and repeatable without losing its truth in the repetition. "I want people to understand that what happened here last night was not remarkable," she said. "That's the point. It was just human. 39 people needed shelter, and I had shelter, and I opened the door. They were decent. They helped. And this morning, other people heard about that and came to help further." She looked at the reporter steadily. "The remarkable part, the part that should make people angry, not inspired, is that this kind of basic decency is treated as a surprise. We've spent so long organizing the world around suspicion that when someone acts like a person to another person, it makes the news." She paused. "Fix that part. If you want to do something useful with your camera, point it at why we consider basic humanity to be extraordinary." The reporter stared at her for a moment. He was younger than she'd first thought, mid-20s maybe, on his first or second real assignment. He wrote down what she'd said with the particular focused intensity of someone who knows they've just been given a quote they're going to use. Hawk, beside her, said nothing, but she felt him nod. The day moved with the specific, compressed energy of something operating on its own momentum. Grace stopped trying to track all of it simultaneously and instead let herself be where she was needed most, moving from conversation to conversation, from decision point to decision point, trusting the people around her to handle the spaces between. Garrett was running the repair coordination with a clipboard and a logistics mind that Grace suspected he'd developed on job sites over decades. Conrad was managing the legal documentation with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that this particular Tuesday was going to be referenced in filings for years. Rachel had transitioned from medical monitoring to general coordination, moving through the groups of arriving volunteers and directing people to where they were most needed, with the assurance of someone who had spent years thinking about which resource went where. It was Rachel who came to find Grace at noon with a name written on a piece of paper. Margaret Sorensen called, she said. She called the diner's main line. She got the number off the website. Frank answered. She paused. She's been crying. Frank was on the phone with her for 20 minutes. He thinks she needs to talk to you. Grace took the paper. Frank was on the phone for 20 minutes. He cried too, Rachel said. He's not admitting it, but he did. Grace went to the phone in the back hall, the old one, the landline, because the diner's cell reception was overwhelmed by the number of devices currently operating in and around the building, and she called the number on the paper. Margaret Sorensen answered on the second ring. Her voice had the quality of someone who had spent a long time keeping something in and was not entirely confident they could continue doing so. She was 71, as Conrad had said. She'd run the hardware store in Carroll County for 38 years. When the inspection notices came, she'd tried to fight them. But the violations were documented, or appeared to be, and the fines were real, and the lawyer she'd consulted had told her the costs of fighting would likely exceed the costs of settling. She'd sold. She'd moved into a smaller place. She told her daughter it was fine. She told everyone it was fine. I knew it wasn't, she said. I knew something was wrong. The violations they cited, I'd had that building inspected by a private inspector the year before. It was clean. And then 6 months later, I'm getting notices about violations the private inspector didn't find. Her voice held itself steady through sheer stubbornness. Grace could tell. Nobody believed me. My daughter thought I was in denial. My lawyer thought I was looking for someone to blame. She paused. And then I woke up this morning, and there's this story about a woman in the Blue Ridge who wouldn't sell, and I read those document descriptions, and she stopped. You recognize the pattern, Grace said. I recognize the pattern, Margaret said. And I need someone to tell me that I wasn't crazy, that it was real, that what happened to my store was actually, it was real, Grace said. You weren't crazy, and you're not alone. The silence on the other end of the line was the specific silence of a person receiving something they had needed for a very long time. Grace let it be silence. She didn't fill it with reassurance or practical next steps. She just held the line and let Margaret Sorensen have the moment. After a while, Margaret said, What do I do? I have a lawyer here, Grace said. His name is Conrad Marsh. He's going to want to talk to you, with your permission. He's been building a picture all morning, and your store is part of it. Your experience matters to what happens next. She paused. But that's Conrad's job. My job right now is just to tell you that what happened to you was wrong, and that the people who did it are being looked at hard, and that you were right to know it wasn't fine. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. Do you want Conrad's number? Grace asked. Yes, Margaret said. Yes, I do. Grace gave it to her. And when she hung up, she stood in the back hallway with her hand on the old phone for a moment, because the weight of what was in that conversation needed somewhere to settle before she went back to the rest of the day. She heard footsteps and looked up. Laura was standing at the end of the hallway. She was 38, with Walter's height and Grace's eyes, and she'd driven 3 hours from Nashville, and she looked like the drive had given her time to think about things she'd been not thinking about for a while. She was carrying a bag over one shoulder, and her face had the expression of a person who has arrived at a place they'd been wrong about and is not sure how to say so. I got here faster than I said, Laura said. I can see that. There were 2 news vans on the highway, Laura said, and what looked like a catering setup in your parking lot. That would be Denny Kowalski from Abingdon, Grace said. He called Frank at 10 this morning and said he was bringing a food truck because the story had hit his Facebook and he wanted to contribute. Frank said yes before I could weigh in on it. Laura looked at her. Frank makes a lot of independent decisions. Frank's earned them, Grace said. They stood in the hallway and looked at each other across the particular distance that builds between people who love each other and have been in disagreement about something important for long enough, that the disagreement has taken on a shape of its own, a third presence that has to be acknowledged before you can reach past it. Laura said, I watched from the parking lot for a few minutes before I came in. All right. I watched this man, big man, gray at his temples. I watched him get a group of maybe 30 people, organized and moving toward the east side of the building with what looked like lumber and a very specific plan. And they were talking to each other, pointing things out, working out a sequence. And I realized, she stopped. I realized I've been thinking about this place wrong. Grace waited. I've been thinking about it like an asset, Laura said. Something with a market value and maintenance costs and a risk profile. I've been thinking about whether it makes financial sense. She looked at her mother. I've been thinking about the wrong things. You've been thinking like someone who loves me and doesn't want to see me fail, Grace said. That's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Laura's jaw tightened and then released. What is it actually? She said. What is this place actually? Because I'm looking at 400 people on a Tuesday and I'm trying to understand. Grace thought about how to answer that, honestly, in a way that was hers and not a speech, not a version of something she'd said before. It's the last place I made something with your father, she said. And it's the place where something keeps happening that I can't make happen anywhere else. People stop here because the road keeps going and they need a moment. And in that moment, sometimes they're more honest than they are everywhere else. Because they're tired, or they're cold, or they've been driving for 6 hours and all the performance has fallen off them. She paused. That's what Walter understood. That a diner isn't a restaurant. It's a pause. And a pause is where people are real. She looked at Laura. I can't sell a pause, and I don't want to. Laura stood with that for a long moment. Then she set her bag down on the hallway floor and said, Tell me what you need, not what you want me to do, what you actually need. Grace considered it genuinely. I need someone to help me with the financial structure, she said. I've been running the books the way Walter set them up 40 years ago, and that worked for 40 years. But the world has changed, and I haven't changed with it. I need modernization I don't know how to do. She paused. But I need the ledgers kept. His handwriting is in those ledgers. I need both things. I can do both things, Laura said. I know you can, Grace said. I never doubted the capability. I doubted the willingness. I know, Laura said. I'm sorry. Grace reached out and put her hand on her daughter's face. Briefly, the way you touch something you've been worried about. Then she said, Come and meet some people. There are about 400 of them, and they all have a name. The afternoon carried its own series of revelations, each arriving in the particular sequence that days will sometimes arrange when they've decided to be definitive. Hawk told Grace at 2 o'clock that the final count of people who had come that day arriving by bike, by truck, by car, some having driven since before dawn, was 431, not counting the original 39 who had been there since the night before. 468 people on a Tuesday in November because one woman had unlocked a door in a storm. She sat with that number for a full minute before she could do anything else. The repairs were progressing with the steady, unstoppable rhythm of a well-organized crew that knows what it's doing and has enough help. The roof, which Dennis had said would take 2 days under normal circumstances, was on track to be substantially complete by end of day because he had 6 experienced roofers working it instead of 2. The panel replacement was done by 1:30. The electrician team had found two additional issues while they were in there and addressed them without being asked, leaving behind documentation of everything they'd done. The furnace part had been sourced from Asheville and was in transit, arriving, according to the heating specialist, by 4. Victor, the retired electrician from the night before, stood next to the new panel in the hallway and looked at it the way a man looks at a problem that has been solved correctly. He said, to no one in particular, That's how that should have looked for years. I know, Grace said. Whoever told you this building was a safety risk was either working from fraudulent documents or they never looked at the actual building. Both, Grace said. Victor turned to look at her. He had a face that had been shaped by decades of honest work, and what it was showing now was the specific anger of a craftsman confronting deliberate dishonesty about something in his field. I want to put that in writing, he said. A professional assessment. What I found last night What was actually wrong versus what they claimed was wrong. He paused. Would that be useful? Conrad, Grace called. Already have a form for that, Conrad said from the foretop, without looking up. Victor went to the table. Grace watched him sit down across from Conrad, pick up a pen, and begin writing with the focused intensity of a man who takes professional testimony seriously. That document, she already knew, was going to matter. It was going to be the specific, technical refutation of the fraudulent inspection claims, written by a licensed professional who had examined the building the same night the demolition assessment was supposedly justified. The afternoon also brought Darnell Washington. He arrived at 2:40, driving a truck from Kingsport, Tennessee, 4 hours south. He was 53 years old, built like someone who had spent his 20s doing physical work and his 30s managing other people doing physical work. And he came through the door of the Golden Lantern with the specific careful movement of a man who wasn't sure of his welcome and was prepared to be fine with that. Grace was behind the counter when he walked in. She recognized him from the name, before she could have recognized him any other way Conrad had described him, and Hawk had described him. And she'd been carrying his story in her chest since 2 in the morning. She came around the counter. Darnell Washington, she said. He stopped. Yes, ma'am. I'm Grace Bennett. She held out her hand. I've been told your grandfather's tools were in that shop. His face did something fast and then controlled it. Yes, ma'am, they were. I'm sorry, Grace said. Not sorry in the general way. Sorry that it happened, and sorry that nobody caught it in time to stop it. And sorry that you drove 4 hours today, when you've already been through enough. He looked at her for a long moment. I drove 4 hours, he said, because Conrad called me this morning and told me that the woman who wouldn't sell and the woman who already lost something are both going to need to be in the same place at the same time when this goes to the civil proceeding. He paused. And because I wanted to see the diner that held the door open, Grace said, come have some coffee. He sat at the counter, and Frank put a plate in front of him without asking. And for a while, the three of them, Grace, Darnell, Frank sat in the relative quiet of the diner's interior, while the controlled, productive noise of 400 people working surrounded them on all sides. And it felt, Grace thought, like the eye of something, the calm center of a storm that was finally moving in the right direction. Darnell said, after a while, they took it from me fair and square on paper. That's the part that got me. I kept looking at the documents, and everything looked real. Everything looked official. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. But the thing about official-looking documents is they look exactly the same, whether they're real or not. And most people, most regular people, not lawyers, not accountants, they look at something official and they assume it means what it says. That's exactly what they counted on, Grace said. I know that now, he said. I knew it before in my gut. But knowing something in your gut and being able to say it out loud are different. He looked at her. You had the documents. You had Conrad. He gestured broadly at the window, at the sound and activity beyond it, all of this. I had a lawyer who told me the fight would cost more than what I'd get back. He paused. I'm not bitter about it. I'm past bitter. I just want it on record. Conrad's putting it on record, Grace said. And so is the state attorney general. Darnell nodded slowly. Then he looked around the diner, at the booths, at the amber lamp, at Frank's immaculate kitchen visible through the pass-through, at the framed photographs on the wall near the register, including the one of Walter that Grace had hung there the year he died. Your husband built this place? He said. He did. Good man. The best I ever knew, Grace said. They sat with that for a moment. Then Hawk appeared in the doorway, and something in his posture told Grace the day had produced another development. She read it in the way he stood, not alarmed, not urgent, but carrying information that had weight. What? She said. He sat down on the stool next to Darnell, and the two men looked at each other for a moment in the way of people who have heard each other's names from multiple directions and are now occupying the same room for the first time. Crane's attorney reached to Conrad 20 minutes ago, Hawk said. Crane is resigning, effective immediately in exchange for, he paused, I don't know the exact terms. Conrad's handling it, but the resignation is real. The word resignation landed in the diner with a specific gravity. Grace absorbed it. She didn't feel the victory she'd expected to feel, Or rather, she felt it. But it was quieter than she'd anticipated, and smaller. Because a resignation was only the end of one thread in something that still had many threads running. The other property owners, she said. Whatever deal he makes can't erase what happened to them. Conrad's already said that, Hawk told her. He's been very clear with the attorney that any cooperation deal needs to include full disclosure of all affected properties and full support for civil recovery actions. Grace turned to Darnell. His tools, she said. The grandfather's tools. We're going to try. Darnell looked at her with an expression that was not hope exactly. He'd been through enough that hope required more foundation than 24 hours could provide, but it was something adjacent to it. Something that had been dormant, deciding to consider the possibility of light. I know you are, he said. The afternoon continued giving. The Lantern Table Fund, as it came to be called. Though it wasn't called that yet, not until Laura sat down with Hawk and Conrad and Grace at the foretop at 3:30, and they worked out its structure. Together began not as a formal decision, but as a natural emergence. Hawk had collected money from the arriving riders throughout the day. People pressing cash and checks into his with the straightforward generosity of people who have decided to participate in something. By mid-afternoon, it was a significant sum. Grace had already said she wouldn't take donations for herself, but the conversation about what else it could be, and what it should do, and what principles should govern it happened in the booth nearest the door over coffee that Laura had poured and Frank had brewed. It was Grace who said the line that became the fund's guiding rule, and she said it without intending to write policy. She said it because it was true, and she needed it to be said out loud. Nobody should have to perform their suffering to earn a seat at this table. The room around the foretop went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said correctly. Laura wrote it down. By 5 o'clock, the roof was substantially complete. The panel was certified operational. The furnace was running on its new part, and the porch had been reinforced by Garrett's crew with the particular care of people who understand that a porch is not merely functional, it is the first thing a place says about itself to anyone approaching. 431 people were beginning the slow, organized process of preparing to leave, not with the abruptness of a crowd dispersing, but with the gradual quality of guests at the end of a gathering that nobody wanted to end, but everyone understood was over. Hawk found Grace at the edge of the lot as the light began changing, the November afternoon heading toward its early close. He didn't say anything immediately, which was still his habit, and she still appreciated it. After a while, he said, "How are you doing?" Grace considered the question with genuine attention, the way she always tried to consider genuine questions. "Tired," she said. "More grateful than I have words for. Angry about Darnell and Margaret and whoever else there is that we haven't found yet." She paused, and strangely, absolutely certain about this place for the first time in a long time, which is maybe the strangest part of all. Hawk looked at the building, at Walter's Diner, now with a new roof and a functioning panel and a porch that sat level for the first time in years, and a fund in formation to help people who needed it, and a legal action in progress that was going to have real consequences for real people who had done real wrong. She opened her door, he said. It wasn't to Grace. It was barely to anyone. Just the thing that had been at the center of all of it, said quietly. Walter always said, Grace told him, that you don't need to know someone's whole life before you decide not to leave them in the rain. Hawk turned and looked at her. That's what I was doing, she said. Just that. That's the whole of it. He nodded. And something in his face, the long-held weight she'd seen underneath the surface since he first came through her door the night before, shifted. Not gone, but differently arranged. Like a man who had been carrying something at a bad angle and had finally found a better way to hold it. They stood together in the November cold and watched 430 people prepare to leave. The amber lamp came on automatically as the light dropped. The way it always did, the timer Walter had set before Grace could bring herself to touch any of his settings. It lit the front of the diner in its particular warm gold, visible from the highway, visible from the parking lot, visible from the curve of Route 221, where the road turned and disappeared into the mountain. A light left on for anyone still on the road. Still burning. The last bike left the parking lot at 6:42 that evening. Grace stood at the door and watched the tail light disappear around the curve on Route 221. And then she stood there a moment longer, in the particular quiet that follows a very loud and very full thing. The lot was empty except for her own car, and Frank's truck, and Laura's rental, and Hawk's bike, which was still there because Hawk was still there, sitting in the booth nearest the door with his third cup of coffee and no apparent urgency about being anywhere else. Conrad had left at 5:30, heading back to Roanoke with 3 organized folders of documentation and a phone that had not stopped receiving calls since 11 that morning. His last words to Grace had been precise and lawyerly, and therefore, she'd come to understand his version of reassuring. The civil action will take time. Do not expect speed. Expect thoroughness. Then he'd shaken her hand with both of his, which she suspected was not his standard departure, and walked out. Garrett had left at 6 with his crew. After walking the perimeter of the building one final time and giving Grace a printed copy of his assessment with every repair annotated and the licensing information for everyone who'd worked on it. For your records, he'd said. And for any future inspection. The weight in that last sentence was deliberate, and she'd felt it correctly. Darnell Washington had stayed until nearly 6. He and Conrad had spent 2 hours together at the foretop, and Grace had not interrupted them because what was happening at that table needed to happen without witnesses, except the ones who were part of it. When Darcel finally stood to leave, he'd come to find Grace in the kitchen where she was helping Frank restore some semblance of order to a space that had fed close to 500 people since midnight. He'd said, "I don't have words for today." Grace had said, "You don't need them." He'd nodded. Then, at the door, he'd turned back one more time. "The tools," he said. "I told myself a year ago to stop thinking about them, to let them be gone." He stopped. "I'm going to let myself think about them again, just a little." He'd left before she could respond, which she thought was probably intentional. Now the diner was quiet in the way it almost never was, not the empty quiet of a closed business, but the settled quiet of a place that has been full and is resting. Laura was at the counter with Walter's ledgers open in front of her and her laptop beside them, doing the thing Grace had asked her to do, working with the careful respect of someone handling someone else's sacred object. She'd been at it for 2 hours. She hadn't complained once. She hadn't suggested digitizing the ledgers, or retiring them, or updating the system in a way that would make them obsolete. She'd simply asked where the entries started and begun there, reading her father's handwriting with an expression Grace had only caught once from across the room, but had needed to look away from quickly because of what it contained. Frank was washing dishes with the systematic meditative focus he brought to every repetitive kitchen task. He'd been on his feet for 22 hours, and he would not admit it. And Grace was not going to be the one to say it because saying it would embarrass him. And Frank's dignity was not something she was willing to compromise on a day when he had, among other things, fed 468 people out of a kitchen designed for a weekday lunch crowd. Maya had swept the dining room 3 times and was now reorganizing the supply cabinet in the back hallway with the energy of a person processing something large through physical action. Grace recognized the pattern. She'd done it herself in various forms across various difficult days. Hawk looked up when Grace came back inside. "Everybody's clear," he said. "Everybody's gone." She sat down across from him. "Except you. I've got nowhere to be until morning." "Then you'll stay," Grace said. It wasn't a question, and they both understood that. The diner settled into its evening rhythm, which was slower and quieter than anything it had experienced in the past 18 hours, and Grace let herself sit in it without immediately filling it with the next task. She was tired in the way that went past physical, the kind of tired that lived in the decision-making part of your mind, the part that had been running at full capacity since the moment she'd seen those headlights coming around the mountain curve the night before. Hawk said, "I need to tell you something." His tone was the same as always, measured, direct, not performing anything, but there was a quality underneath it that Grace hadn't heard before. She waited, When I sent that message last night, he said, the photograph, the post. I told you, I asked people to come with skills and tools and evidence. He paused. What I didn't tell you, what I didn't know how to tell you, was why I did it the way I did. Why I was specific about peaceful. Why I was specific about useful. He looked at the table for a moment. There have been times in my life when the response to something like this would have been different. When the people in my world would have handled a Crane or a Rourke very differently than we handled them today. Grace said nothing. I'm not going to pretend that history doesn't exist, he said. I'm not going to perform a version of myself for you that edits out things that actually happened. He looked at her directly. But I'm also telling you that the reason today went the way it went, documented, legal, above board, with a licensed electrician and a retired lawyer and a roofing permit, that was a choice. A real choice. Made specifically because of what you did last night. He paused. You treated us like people before you knew our history. So we showed up like people. That's not automatic. That's a response. Grace held his gaze. Are you telling me I changed something? I'm telling you that the 39 people who were in this building last night went back to wherever they came from carrying something different than what they arrived with. He was quiet for a moment. And the 430 who came this morning are going back with something too. I can't quantify it. I just know it's real. Grace thought about that. She thought about Maya's face at the window at 4:30 in the morning. About Rachel's hands steady on Tommy's pulse. About the man who'd rigged the tarp over the leak because his grandfather had a place like this. About Victor's professional outrage at a fraudulent inspection. About Darnell allowing himself to think about the tools again, just a little. It goes both ways, she said finally. You think I'm not carrying something different? Hawk looked at her. I'm 63 years old, Grace said. I've been running this diner since before your chapter existed. I thought I knew what this place was, what it could be, what it couldn't be, what kind of night it was capable of holding. She paused. I was wrong about the ceiling. I set the ceiling too low. She looked around the diner at the amber lamp, at Walter's booths, at Laura bent over the ledgers, at the new panel visible through the hallway door, at Frank's kitchen gleaming, from having been cleaned to its bones and started fresh. Walter always said, leave the light on. I left it on. I just didn't know how much it was capable of reaching. The next weeks moved the way the aftermath of significant events always moves in two simultaneous speeds, the public and the private, which rarely synchronized. Publicly, things happened with the compressed urgency of legal and media momentum. The State Ethics Commission's formal investigation generated a preliminary report within 3 weeks, which was, as Conrad explained to Grace in his characteristic emotionless way, extremely fast and indicated the volume and quality of the evidence rather than any particular interest in speed on the Commission's part. Crane resigned before the report was finalized, which Conrad had anticipated and said changed nothing about the investigation's scope. The agreement he negotiated through his attorney included full disclosure of all properties affected by the scheme, which numbered 6 Grace's diner, Darnell's shop, Margaret Sorensen's hardware store, and 3 others along the mountain highway corridor that none of them had known about yet. Calvin Rourke's situation was more complicated, as civil matters always were, and moved correspondingly slower. But it moved. Conrad had connected with 2 other attorneys in the affected counties, and the joint civil action they were building was, as Conrad described it to Grace over the phone in early December, substantial. He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, but Grace had learned to read him well enough by then to know that substantial from Conrad meant something that would matter. Private speed was different. Slower in some ways, faster in others, and far less predictable. Margaret Sorensen came to the diner on the second Saturday of December. She drove up from Carroll County alone, a 3-hour drive, and she sat in the booth nearest the window and ordered coffee and one of Frank's biscuits and looked around the room with the expression of someone who is checking a thing against an image they've built in their mind over weeks. Grace sat across from her, and they talked for 2 hours, and what they talked about was not the legal case. Conrad handled that, but the other thing, The interior thing, the experience of being a woman who ran a place for decades and was told by people who hadn't done it that the time had come to stop. Margaret said, "At one point, my daughter thought she was being practical. I know that. I'm not angry at her." She stirred her coffee. "But there's a kind of practical that doesn't account for what a thing actually is, what it means. The practicality just sees the liability and the maintenance costs and the market value and the risk profile." She stopped. "It doesn't see the 23-year-old who came in the day after his father died and sat in the same spot for 4 hours and didn't order anything after the first cup, and I kept refilling it anyway." She looked at Grace. "Where does that go on the balance sheet?" "It doesn't," Grace said, "which is why the balance sheet was always the wrong tool." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Your daughter came around." "She did." "How?" Grace thought about Laura in the hallway, about the bag on the floor and the one deliberate breath. "And I want to say something to him, and I've been thinking about this place wrong." "She came and she looked," Grace said. "That's all it took. In the end, she looked at what was actually here, instead of what she was afraid it was going to cost me." She paused. "Some people need to see a thing to believe it. That's not a failure. That's just how some people are built." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "My daughter hasn't called since the article." Grace heard what was underneath that sentence. "Give her time," she said. "She's working out how to apologize without saying she was wrong. It takes some people longer than others." Margaret almost smiled. "How long did it take yours?" "About 19 hours, Grace said. "But the storm helped." Margaret's daughter called 2 weeks later. Grace heard about it in a text from Margaret on a Thursday morning, not a long text. "Just," she called, "we talked for 2 hours. Thank you for the patient's advice." Grace sent back a single line, "I'm glad." Then she put the phone down and stood in her diner in the 7 o'clock quiet before Frank arrived and let herself feel the particular satisfaction of a thing going right in a world that didn't always arrange itself that way. The Lantern Table Fund became official in mid-December, filed and structured with Conrad's help and the accounting expertise of a woman named Joelle, who'd been one of the 430 and had, it turned out, spent 15 years as a nonprofit financial manager before transitioning to her current work. She'd reached out to Grace the week after the storm, introduced herself by email, explained her background, and offered her services at no charge because, she wrote, the fund's guiding rule was the most accurate statement about emergency assistance she'd encountered in 15 years in the sector. The rule had already been cited 3 times in coverage of the story by then. Grace had not planned for it to travel that far. She'd said it because it was true. But true things, she was discovering, sometimes had further range than their authors anticipated. The first meal served through the Lantern Table Fund happened on December 19th. A family of 4 who'd been stranded by car trouble on Route 221. The parents exhausted and embarrassed in the way people get when an emergency has stripped the performance away and left only the need. Maya had spotted them in the lot before they'd worked up the nerve to come inside. And she'd gone out to them with 2 cups of coffee and said simply, "Come in. There's food and it's warm, and you don't need to explain anything." The father had started to say something about paying, and Maya had said, "There's a table with your name on it. That's all." They'd come in and eaten and sat for an hour, and when they left, the mother had taken Maya's hand and said something Grace couldn't hear from across the room, but that made Maya stand very still for a moment after they'd gone. Grace didn't ask what the mother had said. She didn't need to. The months that followed the storm changed the Golden Lantern in ways that Grace had not planned and could not have planned. Because the specific thing that changes a place is never the thing you predict. It's always the lateral thing. The one that arrives from an angle you weren't watching. What changed was not the volume of customers, though the volume increased, particularly on weekends, as word spread and people came up Route 221 specifically to see the diner they'd heard about. What changed was the quality of the room. People who arrived already knowing the story arrived with something different in their posture than people who simply stopped because they were tired. They arrived with intention, with a kind of openness, and that openness was contagious. Regulars noticed it. Frank noticed it. Even the room itself seemed to notice it, in the way that rooms respond to what happens inside them over time, accumulating the residue of all their days. Maya, by March, was running the floor with an authority and ease that Grace watched with something close to parental satisfaction. She'd asked in February to learn every part of the operation, not just waitressing, but ordering and scheduling and the back office work, the parts that Grace had always kept in her own hands, because there had always been only her own hands to keep them in. Grace had said yes without hesitation. They'd fallen into a working rhythm that reminded Grace, quietly and without sentiment, of the way things had worked when Walter was alive, two people who understood a place and moved through it together with the efficiency of shared understanding. "You're training your replacement," Frank told Grace one afternoon in March, with the directness he deployed regularly and without apology. "I'm training someone who loves this place," Grace said. "That's not the same thing." Frank thought about this. "It might end up being the same outcome." "Someday," Grace said. "Not yet." Frank accepted this the way he accepted most things, by going back to cooking. Hawk called on a Thursday in February, the first time he'd called since a brief check-in in December. His voice was the same, measured, direct, no performance, but there was something in it that Grace hadn't heard before. Something lighter, a quality of ease that the weight she'd noticed underneath him in November hadn't allowed. He said, "I need to tell you something and I don't entirely know how." "Try directly," Grace said. "That's been working for you." He was quiet for a moment. "I have a sister," he said. "Younger. She lives in Harrisonburg. We haven't spoken in a long time." He paused. "She called me in November, after the diner. She'd seen the article." He stopped again. "She said she'd read about what happened, and she'd read the quote from you, the one about not needing to know one's whole life before deciding not to leave them in the rain. And she said that she'd been doing something wrong. For years, she'd been deciding who I was from a distance and not looking." Another pause. "She said she wanted to look." Grace sat down on the stool at the counter. The diner was empty in the mid-afternoon way. Just Frank in the kitchen and the amber lamp in the February light. "Did you let her?" Grace asked. "I called her the day after she called me," Hawk said. "We've talked most weeks since." His voice was very quiet. "She has 2 kids I've never met, a boy and a girl. She sent me pictures." He stopped. "I've been carrying this for years. The gap between us, I thought it was just the shape of things. Permanent." He paused. "It wasn't permanent. It was just unaddressed." Grace closed her eyes briefly. She thought about 9 years the amber lamp burning for a man who could no longer see it, and the specific grace of continuing to do the thing he'd asked, even in his absence, and how sometimes you did not know what a sustained practice was building toward until it arrived. "Raymond," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. Not Hawk Raymond. He heard it. She knew he heard it because he went quiet in a different way. "You are a good man," she said. "I told you that the first night, and it was true then, and it's true now." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had changed again, not broken. Nothing so dramatic, just different. Like something that had been braced was allowing itself to be something else. "I'm going to bring her by sometime," he said. "If that's all right." "The diner. I want her to see it." "The door will be open," Grace said. The first anniversary arrived in November, like arrivals do, faster than expected, weighted with the particular gravity of a year that had changed the shape of things. The building stood solid under its new roof, warm from its reliable furnace, lit by its properly certified electrical system. The porch sat level. The back booth no longer had a bucket beneath it. Walter's ledgers were supplemented now by a modern accounting system that Laura had built to interface with, rather than replace them, both things, as promised, intact. Adele Park came back for the anniversary, this time with a photographer. She sat in the same booth, drank the same coffee, and asked Grace different questions than the ones she'd asked the year before, not about what happened, which everyone now knew, but about what came after, which was the harder story and the truer one. Grace answered them honestly, including the parts that were not tidy. She talked about the civil action, which was ongoing and slow and exhausting, even when you were not directly involved in the daily work of it. She talked about Margaret Sorensen, whose daughter had come for Christmas and stayed 4 days, and about Darnell Washington, who had found 3 of his grandfather's tools at an estate sale in January, not through any legal mechanism, just through a contact network that had been quietly looking, because that was apparently something that networks did when they decided to care about something. He'd called Grace when he found them, and his voice had sounded like a man standing in a place he'd thought he'd never get back to. She talked about Maya running the floor, and Frank's biscuits and Laura's spreadsheets living beside Walter's handwriting. She talked about the Lantern Table Fund's first year, which had served 41 families and 17 individuals, which was 41 families and 17 individuals who had needed a seat at a table that didn't ask them to perform their suffering first. And then, in the middle of the interview, the door opened. Hawk came in first. He was wearing the same jacket he'd worn that November night a year ago, the Hell's Angels patch visible, the gray at his temples exactly as it had been. Behind him came a woman Grace hadn't met, perhaps 40, with his same careful way of entering a room looking, observing, taking stock before committing to a position. And behind her, hanging back slightly in the way of children who are not yet sure whether a new place is safe, 2 kids, a boy of maybe 9, a girl of maybe 6, both dark-haired, both looking at the amber lamp with the particular wide attention of people seeing something for the first time that they've heard about. Hawk stopped in front of Grace. He said, "This is my sister, Clara, and her kids." Clara looked at Grace with an expression that contained many things at once. She'd read the article. She knew this woman's name and her story and the quote that had sent her to the phone 11 months ago. She was standing in the place that had been at the center of all of it, looking at the woman it was about, and what she said was, "Thank you." Just that, 2 words, but said with the weight of a year behind them. Grace said, "Welcome to the Golden Lantern. Come and sit down." The boy, his name was Marcus, she learned, went immediately to the booth nearest the window, which was the one with the best view of the parking lot, and pressed his face to the glass to see the bikes Hawk had parked outside. The girl Sophie stood at the counter and studied the amber lamp with the focused intensity of a child conducting a serious investigation. "It's always on," Sophie said. "Not a question. An observation. Always," Grace said. Sophie considered this. Why? Grace looked at the lamp, at the amber light that Walter had hung, and she had maintained through 9 years of early mornings and late nights, and doubts she'd kept private, and a November storm that had changed the shape of everything. "Because someone might still be on the road," she said, "and they should know there's somewhere to stop." Sophie accepted this with the seriousness of a 6-year-old who has been given an answer that satisfies her. Then she climbed up on the counter stool and asked Frank, who had appeared at the pass-through, with the alert readiness of a man who has been watching this scene develop with considerable feeling, whether she could have hot chocolate. "You absolutely can," Frank said, and his voice had something in it that he did not attempt to control. The rest of the original 39 arrived in the next hour. Not all at once, in 1s and 2s and small clusters, parking in the lot that was suddenly full again. Coming through the door with the ease of people returning to a place they'd been before and found good. Grace knew them now. Not just their road names, she knew their real ones, the ones they'd given her in the long hours of that first night. Jesse with his rough hands, Bertie with her paperback, Sal who drove through storms for his oldest friend, Carlos who knew you couldn't help someone you were too afraid to touch, Rachel who came through the door last and found Tommy and Dix already in the back booth and said, without breaking stride, "You two better have kept my seat." They had. When everyone was settled, 39 plus Clara and Marcus and Sophie, plus Frank and Maya and Laura who had driven up from Nashville for the weekend, plus Adele and her photographer who had the sense to stay very quiet and let the room be itself, Hawk stood up from the booth nearest the door. He was not a man who made speeches. Grace already knew this. What he did instead was set something on the table in front of her, a frame, face down, carried in from outside, wrapped in a cloth. He turned it over. It was the photograph. The one he'd taken at 2 in the morning. A year ago, the amber lamp glowing through the rain. 39 bikes in the parking lot. And through the window, the warm interior of a diner that had opened its door when it didn't have to. Printed large and framed in simple dark wood. And on the back, she turned it over and read it 39 signatures, written in 39 different hands. And below the signatures, one sentence. You gave us shelter when the road did not. We will never forget. Grace read it once. Then she read it again. She held the frame in both hands and looked at the photograph at the lamp she'd been tending for 9 years. In the name of a man who'd asked her to leave one light on, at the bikes that had come out of the storm, at the window through which she was visible even now, standing in her own diner, holding this thing. She did not cry. She was not, in the end, a woman who cried easily. But something in her face changed in the way faces change when a weight they've been carrying is acknowledged publicly for the first time, and the acknowledgement doesn't remove the weight but changes its nature from burden to meaning. She hung it that evening beside Walter's photograph, the one she'd put up the year he died. She stood back and looked at them together, Walter and the storm. 41 years and one November night, and she thought that he would have understood every bit of it. That he would have unlocked the door himself, and he would have made the coffee, and he would have stretched the food, and he would have known, without being told, that 39 people caught in a mountain storm were simply people who needed what the lamp promised. She was still thinking about this when Maya appeared at her shoulder. They stood together looking at the 2 photographs on the wall. "Miss Grace," Maya said, "there's a truck on the highway, slowing down." Grace looked toward the window. A solitary truck, indicator on, pulling toward the lot with the tentative approach of someone who isn't sure if the place is open or what the rules are or whether they're welcome. The lot was still full of bikes from the anniversary gathering, which probably made it look more complicated than it was. "I'll go," Maya said. She straightened and went to the door with the ease and certainty of a woman who knew what the door was for and had long since made her peace with opening it. Grace watched her go, watched her step out into the November night, watched her walk to the edge of the lot and wave the truck in with the unhesitating directness of someone who does not keep people waiting in the cold. She turned back to the counter, poured a fresh pot, set cups out. Hawk was watching her from his booth. Clara had fallen asleep with Sophie against her shoulder, and Marcus was still at the window, tracking bikes with the focused enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who has decided what he finds interesting and is not embarrassed about it. Frank was in the kitchen, because Frank was always in the kitchen, because some things about a place remain constant even as everything else changes, and those constants are the bones of the thing, the reason it stands. "You're going to stay open," Hawk said. It wasn't a question. "Until the last person who needs it has a seat," Grace said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. He didn't say anything else, because nothing else was needed. Outside, Maya was talking to the driver of the truck, gesturing toward the door, doing what the diner had always existed to do, making a person feel that the stop they were considering was the right one, that the light they'd followed off the highway had led somewhere real. The amber lamp was burning above the entrance, the same as it had burned for 41 years through every storm the mountain had sent and every morning after. 39 strangers had once come through that door with everything they needed stripped down to the bare truth of it: shelter, warmth, and someone willing to see them. 430 people had come at dawn to make sure the door stayed open. And every night since, and every night to come, Grace Bennett would put the coffee on and leave the lamp burning, because Walter had asked her to, and because he had been right, and because the road was long, and the mountains were dark, and people still needed, above all else, and before anything else, to know that somewhere along the way there was a light that was left on for them, and a door that would open when they knocked, and a woman who would look at their face before she looked at anything else. The golden lantern never closed again.